I'm Mary Dombrowski. Welcome to War and Magic. Jack Klamm spent the last years of his life in the little house behind me. This house is at the center of Bainbridge Island, which is appropriate because it seemed always to be Jack's luck to be in the center of things. He was an eyewitness to events of historic proportion here in the Pacific Northwest. The building of Grand Coulee Dam, World War II code interceptions and communications in Puget Sound, the evacuation of the Japanese from Bainbridge Island, aeronautical work at Boeing plant, and the Bainbridge Island kerfuffle over the controversial Leaving Our Island curriculum. Jack passed away in January 2008 after a year-long illness. Just shortly before his death, his memory sharp and clear, Jack rallied for one last interview. In fact, Jack rallied to such an extent that we have enough material for 3 half-hour episodes. Jack had a lively conversation with Robert Dashiell, himself a decorated naval commander with 24 years of service to our country. Let's go now to their conversation.
Today is the 3rd of December, 2007. I'm Robert Dashiell, retired United States Navy Commander, and today we're meeting with Jack Klamm, who has a treasure of knowledge relating to World War II. He was a communications specialist in the Navy, and we're here to get his actual Navy experience story. Jack?
Well, thank you, Bob. Thank you very much. It's kind of interesting. When I decided I was going to join the Navy, that was the day Poland was invaded, which is back in ¡39. But at that time, I was working on Grand Coulee Dam in the warehouse, and I had smuggled in a radio. I was on graveyard shift, but people were very anxious because things were so tense in Europe. And when the word came through that Poland had been invaded, I knew for sure the U.S. was going to eventually be involved. And not liking mud and trenches and things, I decided right then and there I eventually would join the Navy. I was a young married man there, and so later on, after I was finished with my work at Grand Coulee, I did join the Naval Communication Reserve, because being a ham radio operator, I already knew the Morse code and knew something about communications, and that is very useful. We hams provided a resource for the military, which was extremely valuable because we already had communication experience. And frankly, at the very beginning of the war, we often loaned our own equipment for the military use at first. But anyway, I joined the V3, that's the Naval Communication Reserve, and in March of 1941, I, with my then pregnant wife, was living on Bainbridge Island here in my folks' summer cabin, and I was called to active duty by arrangement so that I would go to the radio school at Fort Ward. The executive officer was also a ham radio operator, which was very helpful. And he alerted me when to volunteer so I'd wind up at this radio school which I wanted to attend. And I did so, and graduated at the head of my class, which I certainly should have because of my background experience in communications. So I graduated in July of '41 and temporarily went to Puget Sound Navy Yard in Bremerton for awaiting further permanent assignment, and did temporary duty at the Radio Communications Center there, which used to be Communications Center for the whole 13th Naval District. That was later moved to Bainbridge Island on what is considered the old Peterson farm. That's because there were 3 activities on Bainbridge Island connected with the Navy, all at Fort Ward. There was the radio school, Then there was the intercept station, which was supposed to be kept very secret, Station S. It was one of a large chain of intercept stations where the Japanese communications are being monitored. And then there was the communications center for the whole 13th Naval District, which was later moved there in February of '42. And now here on the island is Vince Wolfe, an ex-chief radioman who served there. So our paths seem to have crossed many times in the Navy, by the way. But that's really kind of interesting. That like interests, like services. So anyway, quite interestingly, just as I was relieved of temporary duty at Bremerton, I was about to be transferred again to some kind of a school. I never did remember what it was that the Navy was starting up. And they were rounding up candidates for the school in order to fill out a class. And so I was relieved of my duties on Monday, early in December of '41. And I went back on to this radio station on the evening of Friday, December 5th to collect some personal things. And I found that the communications center was on full wartime alert. This was done at the instigation of the chief in charge of the communications center. He did not receive orders. He was aware that the Japanese were jamming our Navy communications in the Pacific all that week. I've never seen publicity on this, but he was aware of it. And then on Friday, they stopped the jamming, and sure enough, Sunday was December 7th, 1941, which we all remember too well. So, of course, when that hit, things really boiled over, as you all know, and there's not much use in trying to repeat what's been said many times about December 7th, except everybody turned to. There was no need to call the men back to the service. They came. And almost immediately I was transferred to staff headquarters in headquarters 13th Naval District in Seattle. In those days they called them naval districts. They have another name now. But it comprised state of Washington and adjacent states and Alaska, which is the Alaskan sector. And there I was a radioman third class, and assigned to the small station used for local communications around the Sound, because we had little bases at Pier 91 and at Port Townsend and other places. And this is for local communications. And also we had already were patrolling Puget Sound with what we called the Inshore Patrol, a little group of ships and a submarine patrol. And of course we already had a net across Rich Passage down here to protect Bremerton. That net was under construction when Pearl Harbor hit, and the men just were taken directly there as they came back from Liberty on that Sunday, and just by the busload in their dress blues and everything. And they worked the net for about 48 hours till they completed it. Thank goodness somebody remembered to send out some truckloads of sandwiches and stuff, because the boys worked around the clock. But anyway, I was at that little station, and among the things, like I mentioned, was communication with the Inshore Patrol, which consisted of the old World War I Eagle Boat 57, which is about half or two-thirds the size of a destroyer, a gift from Henry Ford in World War I. And kind of an interesting ship. It was designed and built in a hurry, and they had to fill the bilge with concrete to keep them from rolling over. But that was the flagship of the Inshore Patrol. And the patrol consisted of the 57, a converted yacht that had belonged to some movie star, I can't remember which one, and 2 or 3 converted tuna boats. All had been equipped with submarine detection equipment. And that was an interesting course of duty because one submarine did slip through, and the Navy has not ever released any publicity on it. I think they were embarrassed. But I was the operator on duty, double duty for 3 days as we chased that submarine up and down Puget Sound. And there's a report periscope here, conning tower out there, and we had one very good report of the submarine fully surfaced in the moonlight off the entrance to Hood's Canal. This would have been about probably late February of '42. And on the 3rd evening, I was on duty, and I took a coded message, a priority message, because that was the highest level of interest that had been evolved. Later on, we came up with something called operational priority, which would even override a priority message. But of course, I couldn't understand it. It was in the usual 5-letter code groups. But I handed it to the duty officer, and then he went into the code room, which is right adjacent to the little radio station there, and didn't quite shut the door. So I put the headphones down on the operating table, turned the volume up, and I went over and listened at the door. And pretty soon I heard him say, "By God, they got the sub." And the next day, there was a little tiny article in the paper. The Navy had conducted depth charge practices off Blake Island. So, to the best of my knowledge, there is probably a Japanese submarine on the bottom in nearly 700 feet of water between Blake Island and Alki Point, which is the deepest part of Puget Sound, which is probably why it's never been run across. But I think there's a submarine there because we never saw or heard of it again.
Jack, do you recall about what month this was?
It was probably end of February of '42, or early March. I don't know exactly. It does not show up in the deck log of the Eagle Boat 57, for which, using the Freedom of Information Act, I bought a copy covering a couple of months. Now, what I didn't have sense enough to buy at the time was to demand and get the war log, which the captain keeps. And the deck log is all routine. You know, took aboard 50 pounds of potatoes and transferred a new man aboard, etc. This kind of thing. So anyway, that's an interesting factor, and through an entirely different source, I have since heard that, according to the hydrophone records of, I don't know which of the Fort Flagler, Fort Casey, one of those had underwater microphones placed out in the channel, and the records, as quoted by a former commanding officer of one of those ports, was that they think 3 submarines got into the Sound and 2 got out over the course of the war. And so that's an independent source that further supports the suggestion that there may be a sub on the bottom out there. And so who knows? But in late March of '41, I received orders detaching me from the little radio station there at in the Exchange Building, which is Navy headquarters in those days, and was transferred to the PC 571, which is a well, it's smaller than a destroyer escort. It's the next size down. It's well, I guess you can't see very well the silhouette on this cap, but it's 173 feet long and only 23-foot beam, which means if you sneeze, it rolls. The ship went to Alaska. I went to the sound school, having been put in charge of the submarine detection equipment, which we called sound gear in those days, because the term sonar had not been invented.
Right.
And so I rejoined the ship in Alaska. I went up on a big old Navy tanker as a passenger. And that is a story in itself, because as a commander, you remember how Navy passengers were treated that weren't part of the crew?
Oh, yes.
Yes, you chip this paint. You scrub this deck. Well, having known that this could happen, I associated myself with the communication officer. As soon as I reported on board in the evening, I looked up the communication officer, and fortunately he wasn't on liberty, and he said, "Oh, great." He said, "I lack just one man for a 3-section watch." Well, he says, "What's your rating?" I said, "Rating in second class," because I'd made second class by then. He said, "Oh, you're third in seniority. You'll be in charge of the third watch."
Fantastic.
So not only did I not have to work as a passenger, I was in charge of one of the watches, which made a certain bosun's mate very unhappy. He knew just what paint he wanted me to chip. But anyway, we headed for Alaska in early November and ran into a real storm off Queen Charlotte Sound, and we had with us, that's the north end of Vancouver Island, the one open spot. Of course, we were going straight across, not the inside passage, a big old fleet tanker, the Klamm. And she was a sister ship to the fleet tanker that was sunk in the first battle of the Coral Sea, one of the several ships that were sunk there. And we hit this storm, and it caught us by surprise, because there were no satellites in those days to warn you about weather. We had as an escort a brand new PC, just like I had it on and was going to rejoin, and a green crew and a green ship. They shouldn't have been sent on that, but everybody was doing everything as fast as they could. This was the beginning of World War II.
That's a tough indoctrination cruise.
You bet it was. They lost a man overboard and another one with a fractured skull because they didn't know enough to secure the depth charge watch when that storm hit. And wouldn't you know, it happened on my watch as a radioman in charge of the watch. And of course I was the outside man, and we got orders to break radio silence and get permission for the PC to turn back. No submarine would operate in weather like that, like we were in, because we just lost all our coffee cups. The ship had rolled so great when that storm hit. We drank coffee from soup bowls the rest of the trip. But so I was handed the message to break radio silence. Well, I was a stranger, so I started down the line. I gave it to my first third-class operator. He said, "I've never operated a live transmitter in my life. It's all been practice." I tried the next one, and I tried the striker. Finally, I had to do it myself. But and then, of course, there was the. Then we had to get permission. I mean, we were requesting permission, and that came over what they call the Fox circuits, which is blind broadcast, so that you don't have to respond directly and reveal your position in breaking radio silence. And permission came, and then we had to break radio silence once more to say the ship was, the PC was on its way back to Seattle, and another coded message. Anyway, arrived in the Aleutians, and I spent some time on shipboard there doing the usual little convoys, Kodiak to Juneau, and around in there, and through the winter storms. And why are those storms in the Gulf? Barometer 27.6.
I've never heard of such
Well,
low barometer.
And so we went through the eye of a storm.
Yeah.
And you know, it is true. There is this open spot in the eye of a storm where there are no clouds above you. And I could look up. But once we broke the ice, because we were collecting saltwater ice to depth about 6 inches on board the ship, and this was not good. But I could look up and see stars and clouds all around me, and a confused sea. And then I got pulled off the ship and put ashore to set up facilities for repairing submarine detection equipment and fallowers and so on at Kodiak. The Admiral moved his flag to Dutch Harbor later on, found there were no facilities there. Next day I was on an old cold DC-3, the heater had failed, on my way to Dutch Harbor to set up facilities there. It didn't waste any time. Yeah. And so I completed a tour of duty up in the Aleutians, setting up things. The battle was not with the Japanese, the battle was with the weather.
Now, were the Japanese in the Aleutians at the time you were there?
Yes, my bunk at Dutch Harbor was right by a place where half the wall had been blasted away. I just missed the bombing of Dutch Harbor, where I noticed in research, in reading, that there seems to be some difference of opinion whether the Japanese were really going to try to land at Dutch Harbor or not. And of course they were caught by surprise by this fighter base about 60 miles west of Dutch Harbor that was highly secret. And so I can't remember the name of the base anyway, but fighter planes showed up and the Japanese had thought they'd do another Pearl Harbor, but they didn't know that, one, we knew they were going to attack in the Aleutians because of our code breaking, and two, we knew that it was a secondary target. The prime target was Midway. That way we were better prepared. And of course they did go on out and take Attu and Kiska and Agatu. Well, they captured 18 people in the weather. I think it was 18. Mostly weather predictors. Big victory. And so I completed my tour duty and came back to the U.S., where I became chief in charge of electronic maintenance for the whole 13th Naval District. They must have been pretty desperate for somebody for that, put me in charge. But anyway, included in my duties was coming back to Fort Ward quite regularly for servicing equipment. Now, Fort Ward at Station S, the intercept station, had its own service personnel, but there were 2 people there who were qualified to service the code machines. On occasion, there'd be one of them would be on liberty, and maybe the other would get sick. Jack, who I was called Bill in the Navy because my legal name is William, would get called from staff headquarters. You know, I was chief in charge of electronic maintenance, meaning if nobody else is around, Jack gets it. So so I had access to the code room, I had access to the total facilities, and also was responsible for VHF radio link, which is very new in those days. All the messages, Japanese messages, which were copied there were re-encoded so that intercepting what came out of Fort Ward would not give away what was going on in detail. They'd be re-encoded and then sent to Washington, D.C., where they had to be decoded twice.
Now, were they transmitted from Fort Ward?
They were transmitted by the VHF radio link in the latter part of the war. Early on, I believe it was by just the hardwire teletype of the cable. I don't know just when that link was put in, but it was before I was transferred back from the Aleutians. And so I spent the remainder of the war as chief in charge of electronic maintenance for the 13th Naval District. And I went to all these bases because we had this VHF radio link tied in for supplementary communications, Port Townsend, Pier 91, other little stations up and down the Sound. And we had a link from Sand Point via an automatic repeater station at Payne Field on up to Whidbey Island, the Naval Air Station up there. And it was separate. It wasn't tied in with the others except by landline. But I serviced that too. And I set up a maintenance schedule, and I went out to each station and I trained the people in the maintenance of it. First of all, I had to get everything going again, which I did with whatever was available, because we had about 1/3 of the channels out. It was a multi-channel system. And about 1/3 of the channels were inoperative in all these links, because this technician wouldn't put in anything but the approved Western Electric part. And try to get approved parts, yeah, if you're 6 months on the waiting list in the wartime. Well, what the heck? A 10,000 ohm resistor is a 10,000 ohm resistor in electronic parlance. So I didn't care where it came from, who made it, what its part number was. If it had the right electronic characteristics, I used it. Good. So I went through it, I got everything working again, and trained people. And this is what I did until the end of the war. But it kept me in and out of Fort Ward, kept me in touch with what was going on, and starting to way back at the beginning of the war, if I may jump back again, when I had been recently sent to staff headquarters in Seattle as a radioman 3rd class, came the day of the relocation of the Japanese from Bainbridge Island. And I was given special liberty to come over here and help my friends, the Nishimori family, pack up. No argument at all. Personnel said, certainly, you have special liberty, go. Because there were mixed feelings about the relocation, mixed feelings at all levels. Because we didn't know then, publicly, about the spy network, which was not revealed until 1977, that there was this extensive spy network in operation up and down the coast, and that our government had the details through breaking of the codes. So, so I had been involved in the relocation, in Station S, intercept, and the handling of repairs of the code equipment, and I just seemed to get involved wherever I went.